It was a busy morning at the airport, and the crowd inside the terminal was moving at a fast pace. People shuffled from one gate to the next, checking their tickets and scanning the boards for flight information. The chatter of voices echoed across the high ceilings, blending with the faint announcements of flight updates. The air was thick with the scent of coffee and the sound of rolling luggage. James, a black man in his early 30s, moved through the crowd with calm confidence. He had just returned from a business conference in New York and was heading back home to Atlanta. Dressed in a simple black suit and carrying his briefcase, James had an air of professionalism about him that was easy to notice. He walked with purpose, but there was a certain ease to his step as if traveling was something he did regularly. As he made his way to the gate, he couldn't help but notice the buzz of excitement around him. It was one of those moments where you felt like everything was happening around you at once. The usual travel fatigue hadn't set in for him yet, and he found himself enjoying the small moments of peace. James had worked hard to get to where he was, and this flight back home felt like another step in the right direction. He had made an impact at the conference, but now, he was just ready to get back to his family and enjoy some quiet time. After a quick check of his boarding pass, he joined the line for security. There was a slight delay as a few people ahead of him had trouble with their bags, but it didn't bother him. He was in no rush. As he passed through the metal detector and grabbed his items, he glanced around, noting the various travelers around him, all looking for their next gate or grabbing a snack. Finally, James boarded the plane, his seat located in the economy section of the plane, where the rows of seats were tightly packed together. He made his way down the aisle, carefully navigating around other passengers who were still settling into their seats. As he reached his row, he noticed the woman sitting next to his seat. She was a middle-aged white woman, probably in her late 40s, with sharp features and a tense look on her face. She was already settled in, her purse carefully placed beside her, and her eyes scanning the area as if she were on edge. James gave her a polite smile as he slid into the aisle seat. She didn't return the smile, but James didn't think much of it. Sometimes people were just caught up in their own worlds, and that was fine. He buckled his seatbelt, pulled out his phone, and glanced at his messages. As the flight attendants began their safety demonstration, he settled in, ready for the long flight ahead. As the plane soared above the clouds, James tried his best to keep his focus on the tasks in front of him. He opened his laptop, sifting through emails and checking messages, but Karen's constant remarks kept echoing in his mind. Every time he thought he could block her out, another comment would slip through the crack. As the flight continued, James couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. The turbulence had passed, the tension between him and Karen seemed to ease, and the quiet calm of the cabin made it easier for him to focus on the journey ahead. He had managed to hold his ground in a conversation that could have easily escalated, but now things seemed to have settled down. It was almost as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. As the plane touched down smoothly, the cabin filled with the familiar sound of wheels making contact with the runway. The sudden change in motion jolted everyone back to reality as the flight crew prepared for the landing procedures. James could feel the excitement building among the passengers, some chatting quietly, others gazing out the window as the city below became clearer. The flight had been long, but it was almost over, and soon they would all be heading in different directions. The moment the seat belt sign turned off, people began unbuckling their belts and standing up, gathering their belongings. The hum of the engines and the chatter in the cabin created a familiar buzz of activity. James followed suit, reaching for his bag in the overhead compartment. He could already hear the sounds of people making their way toward the front of the plane, eager to exit. But before he could leave, Karen spoke again, her voice cutting through the noise of the cabin. "James," she said, almost hesitantly, as she stood beside him. I really wanted to thank you again. For everything. You probably don't realize how much this has meant to me." James paused and turned to face her. For a moment, he could see the same sincerity in her eyes that had appeared earlier in the flight. It was as if this moment, this interaction, had been a turning point for her. He had seen people go through similar shifts before, small but meaningful changes in their understanding of the world around them. But this felt different. It felt like Karen was truly seeing things through a new lens, not just because she had been confronted, but because she had chosen to reflect and learn. "It's nothing really," James replied, offering a small smile. "I just wanted to help, that's all." Karen shook her head, her expression earnest. "No, it's more than that. I've spent so much of my life thinking I had all the answers, thinking I understood the world just because I had my own version of things. But I've realized that I've been blind to a lot of things. The way I've treated people, the assumptions I've made, those are things I need to change." James could tell that this was something Karen had been wrestling with, and he appreciated how openly she was sharing her thoughts. It wasn't easy to admit when you were wrong, especially when it meant looking inward and confronting your own biases. It was clear that Karen wasn't just offering a surface-level apology, she was acknowledging the deeper issues at play. "I'm glad you see that," James said, his tone warm but measured. "It's all about awareness. Once you start to see things from someone else's perspective, things change. It's not about being perfect, but about trying to do better." Karen nodded slowly, absorbing his words. "I've been so caught up in my own world, and I've never really stopped to think about how others experience the world. It's not just about the things we say, it's the little things too. The way we judge people, the assumptions we make without knowing the full story." James could sense the weight of her realization, and he felt a quiet pride in the way she was approaching this moment. Not everyone would take the time to reflect, let alone change their perspective. But Karen had done that, and in doing so, she had grown in a way that was both humbling and inspiring. "Well, you're already on the right path," James said, his voice encouraging. "It's not always easy, but it's a journey. Just take it one step at a time." The sound of the captain's voice came over the intercom, announcing that they had landed safely and should prepare to disembark. The atmosphere in the cabin shifted again, with people beginning to file toward the exits. James grabbed his bag and moved toward the aisle, but before he could leave, Karen spoke one more time. "James," she called, her voice louder this time, as if she didn't want him to leave without saying something else. "I don't think I can make up for what I said earlier, but I want to make it right. I've been given a second chance to see things differently, and I don't want to waste it. I promise you that I'll do better. I'll be more aware of how I treat others." James paused, looking at her with a thoughtful expression. He could see that she was truly sincere, and there was no doubt in his mind that her words came from a place of genuine change. He could have easily brushed it off or dismissed her, but instead, he gave her a small nod of acknowledgement. "I believe you," he said, his voice calm and reassuring. "And remember, it's not about being perfect. It's about trying, every single day." Karen smiled softly, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she said, her voice steady but full of meaning. "You've made me see things in a way I never thought possible. I'll never forget this." With that, Karen turned and made her way toward the front of the plane, disappearing into the line of passengers waiting to disembark. James stood there for a moment, watching her go. He couldn't help but feel a sense of pride in the fact that their brief exchange had made such an impact on her. The words they had shared, though small in the grand scheme of things, had opened her eyes to something greater. And in doing so, it had given James the chance to reflect as well. Sometimes, the smallest moments could lead to the biggest changes, and he was thankful for this one. As he made his way off the plane, James was met with the usual bustle of the airport. People hurried past, each with their own story, their own journey. But for a brief moment, he felt a sense of peace. He had faced a challenge, but he had remained true to himself, and in doing so, had made a difference not just for Karen, but for himself as well. Walking through the terminal, James felt the weight of the world lighten just a little. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew that this was a step in the right direction. And as he made his way to the baggage claim area, his thoughts drifted back to the people he loved, the family, the friends, the people who mattered most. They were the ones who gave him strength and purpose. It was in these small moments, these unexpected encounters, that true change began. And as he walked through the crowded airport, he realized that even the smallest actions could ripple out and create something bigger. The journey wasn't always easy, but it was always worth it. For the first time since the flight began, James could truly relax. He leaned back in his seat, closing his eyes for a moment, letting his mind drift. He thought about his family, the life he had built, and the things he was working toward. The conference he had just attended had been successful, but it hadn't been easy. He had spent countless hours preparing, making sure his presentation was perfect, ensuring that his ideas would be well received. But despite all the work, despite all the preparation, there were always moments that made him question if it was enough. He opened his eyes and glanced around the cabin. Most of the passengers had settled into their own routines. Some were reading, others listening to music, and a few were lost in conversation. The flight attendants moved through the aisle, offering drinks and snacks, keeping everything running smoothly. The gentle hum of the engines and the soft lighting in the cabin created a peaceful atmosphere, and for a brief moment, James allowed himself to simply enjoy the calm. Beside him, Karen sat quietly. Her earlier defensiveness seemed to have completely faded, replaced by a more contemplative expression. She wasn't talking anymore, and James found himself wondering what she was thinking. The earlier conversation had been a turning point, but the silence between them now felt different, less tense, more reflective. A few minutes passed, and then Karen spoke again, this time her voice much softer than before. "I don't know why I was so quick to judge you," she said, her words almost like a confession. "I've always thought of myself as a nice person, but I guess I never really took the time to understand anyone who was different from me." James turned slightly to face her, surprised by her honesty. He wasn't sure what had prompted this shift in her behavior, but he could tell that her words were genuine. She wasn't just saying the right things to make herself look better, she was actually reflecting on her actions. "You don't have to apologize for that," James replied, his voice steady. "It's easy to get caught up in our own worlds, thinking that everyone else must fit into the same mold. But the truth is, we all have different experiences. And sometimes, it takes a wake-up call to see things for what they really are." Karen nodded slowly, her gaze focused on the seat in front of her. "I think you're right," she said quietly. "I've lived a pretty sheltered life. I've never had to worry about what people might think of me based on my appearance, or where I come from. And I never considered what that must feel like for someone else." James could sense the sincerity in her words. It was a far cry from the dismissive attitude she had shown earlier. It was clear that she was beginning to realize just how much her words and actions had hurt him. And for the first time on this flight, James didn't feel like the target of her judgment. "I appreciate that you're willing to see things differently," James said. "It's not easy to admit when we're wrong, especially when we've been so sure of ourselves. But change starts with understanding, and it sounds like you're trying to do that." Karen's eyes met his, and she offered a small, uncertain smile. "I guess I've never really thought about it from that perspective. But I want to try to be better. I don't want to be the kind of person who judges others without knowing them." James smiled in return, the warmth of her sincerity making him feel hopeful. "That's all anyone can do," he said. "We all make mistakes, but it's how we learn from them that matters." For the next few minutes, the conversation slowed as both of them fell into a comfortable silence. The quiet between them wasn't awkward, far from it. It was more of a mutual understanding, a silent acknowledgement that they had both learned something valuable from the exchange. James felt his earlier frustration begin to fade, replaced by a sense of calm. Karen, for her part, seemed lost in thought, her expression more reflective than it had been before. As the plane continued on its journey, James allowed himself to relax once more. His mind wandered back to the things that mattered most: his family, his work, and the things he was passionate about. He thought about the challenges he faced as a black man in a world that often tried to categorize people based on superficial differences. But he also thought about the progress that was being made, the small victories, and the moments of connection that could make all the difference. It was then that something unexpected happened. The seatbelt sign flickered on once more, signaling that the plane was approaching its descent. The flight attendants began their final rounds, preparing the passengers for landing. As the cabin lights brightened slightly, the steady hum of the engines changed, signaling that they were beginning their descent. Karen turned to James, her voice hesitant but sincere. "I know this doesn't make up for what I said earlier, but I just want to thank you. You could have gotten angry, you could have reacted differently, but instead, you chose to be calm. You made me see things in a new way." James was taken aback by her words. He hadn't expected her to thank him, but there was something about her gratitude that made the whole experience feel worthwhile. "You don't have to thank me," he said with a smile. "I just wanted to help you understand. We all need to do better, and it starts with conversations like this." Karen's expression softened, and she nodded. "I get it now. And I promise, I'll do better. I'll be more aware of how I treat people, and I'll think before I speak next time." James smiled, feeling a sense of peace settle over him. It wasn't about proving a point or winning an argument, it was about the connection they had made, the shift in understanding. He could see that Karen was genuinely trying to change, and that was all he could ask for. As the plane began its final descent, James looked out the window one last time. The city below was slowly coming into view, and the excitement of landing filled the cabin. It had been a long flight, full of unexpected twists and turns, but in the end, James felt like he had gained something valuable. He glanced at Karen, who was now looking out the window too, her face thoughtful. They might have started the flight as strangers, but by the time they landed, they had shared something more than just an uncomfortable encounter. They had both learned something important. Demanding his attention. The hum of the engines and the chatter of the other passengers provided a bit of relief, but it wasn't enough to drown out the nagging voice behind him. As the flight continued, the atmosphere in the cabin grew quieter. The hum of the engines, the occasional click of seatbelts being fastened, and the soft murmur of passengers talking among themselves created a peaceful backdrop. But for James, the uneasy tension between him and Karen remained. Though her earlier comments had faded, they lingered in his mind like a distant echo. Despite the calm that surrounded him, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this encounter than just a simple flight. For the next hour or so, he tried to focus on the work in front of him. He opened his laptop again, attempting to catch up on emails, but his thoughts kept drifting back to the conversation with Karen. He had always prided himself on being able to stay calm and composed, but something about her attitude had struck a nerve. It wasn't the first time he had dealt with people like her, but this time, it felt different. Maybe it was because he had just come from an important conference where he had worked hard to present his ideas. Maybe it was because he had worked so tirelessly to build his career and prove himself, only to be reduced to stereotypes by someone who didn't even know him. James sighed, rubbing his forehead as he glanced at the clock. The flight still had a couple of hours left, and the last thing he wanted was to sit through more of Karen's judgmental behavior. He looked around, noticing that many passengers were settling in, some reading, others lost in their own worlds. There was a sense of calm among the crowd, but the silence between him and Karen felt heavy. Karen, for her part, seemed to have calmed down as well. She was no longer speaking to James directly, but her occasional glances toward him made it clear that she was still processing their conversation. James had hoped that she would let it go, but her presence beside him remained a reminder of everything that had happened. Despite her silence, he could sense that something had shifted in the dynamic between them. He could feel it in the way she fidgeted in her seat, her fingers tapping nervously on the armrest. She wasn't the confident, dismissive woman from earlier, now she seemed uncertain, almost apologetic. James didn't know if it was because of his words or the realization that her behavior had crossed a line, but something had clearly changed. As the plane began to make its way across the sky, the seat belt sign flickered on again, signaling that they were about to experience some turbulence. The lights in the cabin dimmed as passengers adjusted their seats and prepared for the bumpy ride ahead. James couldn't help but notice that Karen seemed more on edge now, her eyes darting nervously around the cabin. It was as if the discomfort she had caused earlier had come full circle, and now, she was the one feeling unsettled. A few moments later, the plane hit a patch of turbulence. The aircraft rocked slightly, causing some passengers to grip their armrests and others to brace themselves. James, however, remained calm. He had flown enough to know that turbulence was a normal part of air travel. But as the plane shook a bit more, he noticed Karen glance over at him, her eyes wide with unease. "I've never liked flying," Karen said suddenly, her voice shaky. "I always get so nervous when it gets bumpy." James looked at her, surprised by the change in her demeanor. Her earlier arrogance had given way to a more vulnerable side, and for a moment, she seemed like just another person on a plane, dealing with the discomfort of travel. He nodded sympathetically, trying to keep the conversation neutral. "It can be unsettling for some people," he replied, offering a small smile. Karen glanced at him again, this time a bit more openly. "I guess I owe you an apology," she said, her voice quieter than before. "I didn't mean to come off as rude earlier. I've just been having a tough time lately. I didn't think about how I was coming across." James was taken aback by her sudden admission. He wasn't sure what to make of it. He had expected her to double down on her behavior, but instead, she was acknowledging it. There was a moment of silence between them as the plane stabilized. James wasn't sure how to respond, but he figured it was better to keep the mood light. "Apologies are good, but actions speak louder than words," he said gently, keeping his tone calm and measured. "We all go through tough times, but that doesn't give us the right to treat others poorly." Karen nodded, her eyes cast downward. "You're right. I don't know what came over me. I've always been kind of set in my ways. I guess I've never really thought about how people like you might feel when people like me make assumptions." James noticed that her words were more thoughtful now, less defensive. It seemed like she was genuinely trying to understand, even if it was coming a little too late. "It's not just about you or me," James said, leaning back in his seat slightly. "It's about how we all see each other. Sometimes, people like you forget that not everyone has the same opportunities, or the same experiences." Karen was quiet for a moment, and James could see that she was reflecting on his words. "I suppose I've been guilty of making assumptions about people," she said finally, her voice softer than before. "I've been so caught up in my own world that I've never really stopped to think about the bigger picture." James nodded, appreciating her effort to understand. It wasn't easy for anyone to admit when they were wrong, especially someone who had been so sure of their own beliefs. But he could see that Karen was starting to shift, even if it was just a little bit. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. The turbulence subsided as the plane leveled off, and the passengers began to relax again. Karen, now visibly more at ease, took a deep breath and settled back into her seat. "Thank you for being patient with me," she said, her voice still quiet but sincere. "I think I needed to hear that." James smiled, though he wasn't sure if she fully understood everything he had said. But that wasn't the point. The point was that she had started to think. Maybe this encounter would make her reconsider how she treated others in the future. Maybe it wouldn't. Either way, James knew that he had done his part. As the flight continued on its journey, the rest of the cabin settled into a more peaceful atmosphere. The lights in the cabin brightened slightly, and the sound of the engines became less noticeable. The tension that had once hung in the air between James and Karen seemed to have dissipated, replaced by a quiet understanding. James glanced out the window once more, watching the clouds stretch out below him. It was a beautiful sight, and for a moment, he allowed himself to simply appreciate the calm. There was still a long way to go before the flight landed, but for now, he felt at peace. He had faced Karen's challenges head-on, and no matter what happened next, he had stayed true to himself. For the next hour or so, the plane maintained a steady pace, cutting through the clouds and flying over cities below. The cabin lights dimmed as the flight attendants made their rounds, offering drinks and snacks to the passengers. James accepted a small cup of water, grateful for the brief distraction. But Karen wasn't finished with him yet. As the attendants moved on, she leaned over and whispered, her voice dripping with condescension. "You know," she began, "I can't help but wonder what it's like to live like you." She paused for a moment, as if letting the words sink in, then continued. "You probably think this is a big deal, don't you? Flying around like you're somebody important. But let me tell you, you're not the only one who's had to work hard in life." James felt a flash of irritation stir inside him. He could sense where this was going, and he wasn't in the mood for another one of her speeches about her own struggles. He had heard people like Karen before, the type who would use their own hardships as a way to belittle others, as if their pain somehow gave them permission to treat others poorly. But James wasn't about to let her drag him into that. Instead of responding, he looked out the window, watching the clouds shift as the plane began its climb to cruising altitude. The view outside was beautiful, a patchwork of fields and towns far below, all fading into the vast expanse of the sky. He took a deep breath, focusing on the calmness of the scene outside. But Karen didn't let up. She reached over to grab the armrest, her voice taking on a sharper tone. "Honestly, I'm just trying to understand how someone like you makes it to places like this. What kind of job do you even have? What do you do?" James could feel his patience slipping. He had learned over the years that staying calm in situations like this was the best way to avoid a confrontation, but there was something about Karen's tone that made it harder and harder to keep quiet. The judgment in her words was clear, and her insistence on poking into his life felt invasive and rude. He thought about ignoring her again, but this time, something inside him stirred. He wasn't going to sit quietly and let her think she could walk all over him. Taking another deep breath, James closed his laptop and turned slightly to face her. "I don't think you understand," he said, his voice steady but firm. "I didn't get here by pretending to be someone I'm not. I've worked hard for everything I've achieved. Just because I don't fit into your idea of what people like me should do doesn't mean I'm any less deserving of being here." Karen's eyes widened for a moment, clearly not expecting the response. For a second, the smug expression on her face faltered, but she quickly regained her composure. "Oh, I didn't mean it like that," she replied, her voice still carrying an edge. "I just don't get why people like you are always so quick to play the victim. You're not the only one who's had to work hard." James resisted the urge to roll his eyes. He had heard that line before, the idea that people like him were always trying to claim that the world was against them. But it wasn't about playing the victim. It was about confronting the ignorance that still existed, even in places where it shouldn't. He wasn't going to let Karen's words slide anymore. "No one's playing the victim here," he said, his voice calm but strong. "But you're right about one thing. You don't get it. And that's exactly why I'm telling you this. The world isn't as simple as you think it is, and people like me have to work 10 times harder just to get a seat at the table. That's not a victim mentality, that's reality." Karen stared at him for a moment, her expression now less confident, but still defensive. "Well, I didn't mean to offend you," she said, though her tone lacked sincerity. I guess I didn't expect someone like you to be on a flight like this." James felt the familiar knot in his stomach tighten. Her words still stung, but now he saw something else in her eyes, a mix of confusion and a growing unease. Maybe for the first time, Karen was starting to realize that the world she lived in wasn't as black and white as she had thought. That there were people around her who didn't fit into the neat boxes she had created for them. The tension between them lingered for a few moments, neither of them speaking. James returned his gaze to the window, trying to shake off the frustration that had started to build inside him. He wasn't going to let Karen ruin his flight, but he couldn't deny that her words had gotten under his skin. As the plane continued its journey, James couldn't help but reflect on the conversation. It wasn't the first time he had encountered someone like Karen, someone who thought they could judge him based on his appearance or assumptions about his life. It had happened many times before, but it never got any easier. The small, hurtful comments, the way people would question his worth or try to place him in a box. It wasn't just exhausting, it was demoralizing. He had worked so hard to get where he was, and yet there were still people who couldn't see him for who he truly was. It wasn't just about the job he had or the place he was flying to, it was about everything he had overcome to get there. The years of schooling, the sacrifices, the long nights spent building his career, the countless moments where he had been told he wasn't good enough simply because of who he was. All of that had shaped him into the person he was today, but for some reason, people like Karen couldn't see that. But no matter how many times he encountered people like her, James knew he had to keep going. He had worked too hard to let anyone define his worth for him. The seatbelt sign blinked off, signaling that the plane had reached cruising altitude. Flight attendants began their rounds again, and James was offered a snack and a drink. He politely declined, his mind still swirling with thoughts of the conversation. Karen, for her part, seemed to have calmed down a bit. Her words were fewer now, and her posture had relaxed slightly. She didn't seem as confident as before, and for a moment, James thought she might have realized how out of line she had been. But as the hours ticked by, he couldn't shake the feeling that she was still sizing him up, still trying to make sense of him in a way that wasn't fair or kind. He could only hope that, by the time the flight ended, she would have learned something. But at the very least, he knew that he had stood his ground. It wasn't long before Karen, as James would later learn her name was, began to make small comments. At first, they seemed harmless enough. She looked at the flight attendant and muttered something about how the flight was taking too long to board. James tried to ignore her, but it was hard not to overhear. Her voice was loud and shrill, cutting through the quiet hum of the plane's cabin. As the flight took off, the plane's engines roared to life, and Karen shifted in her seat, clearly uncomfortable. She adjusted her purse once again, then turned to James. "You know, I don't think I've ever seen someone like you in this section before," she said, her tone clipped and judgmental. James, still trying to be polite, didn't respond immediately. He looked out the window, hoping she would drop the conversation. But Karen wasn't done. She continued, her voice growing louder as if she wanted others to hear her. "I just don't understand how some people manage to get into these flights. I thought they reserved the good seats for the important people." James felt a knot form in his stomach. He didn't like the direction the conversation was going. He had heard these types of comments before, and he wasn't in the mood to engage with them. But he was trapped in the seat beside her, and there was nowhere to go. He gave a small, polite laugh, hoping that would end the conversation. But Karen wasn't finished. She leaned forward, her voice now carrying across the aisle. "You know," she said with a slight chuckle, "I bet you're not even going to get off in a big city like New York or Los Angeles. You're probably heading to some tiny town. People like you, they never end up where the real money is." James clenched his fists under the armrest. It took a lot of effort to stay calm. He had been through situations like this before, people making assumptions about him based on his appearance, his race, or even his clothes. But this was different. Karen wasn't just being rude, she was being openly disrespectful. James decided to ignore her again. He pulled out his laptop and started working on some emails, hoping she would take the hint. But Karen wasn't about to let it go. She started making snide remarks about his clothes, asking if he had ever owned a designer suit. She even went so far as to ask if he was traveling for a low-level job. The other passengers around them started to notice the tension. A few glanced over, but no one said anything. The flight attendants seemed to be busy with their own duties, and no one intervened. James felt a surge of frustration building up. He knew that if he said something, it would likely make things worse. But Karen's words were starting to sting. Why was she doing this? What did she hope to accomplish? He wanted to speak up, to say something that would put her in her place, but he held back. This was not the time or place for a confrontation, he thought. But Karen didn't stop. She continued to talk, her voice louder now, as if she was getting a rise out of James. You know, I bet you're the kind of person who thinks just because you're on a plane, you've made it, she said, sneering. I'm sure it's all part of your little fantasy. The words stung, but James refused to let her see that. He took a deep breath, looking out the window again. He reminded himself that he didn't need to engage with this. It wasn't worth it. But Karen wasn't done. She leaned closer to him and whispered, "It's just so funny to me, how some people think they can just pretend to be something they're not." James closed his eyes for a moment, trying to center himself. The plane was in the air now, and the cabin was starting to settle down, but Karen's voice still rang in his ears. He had heard worse, of course, but for some reason, today felt different. Maybe it was the fact that he had just come from a business event, or maybe it was the way she had spoken to him like he didn't belong on that plane. As the flight progressed, Karen finally seemed to settle into her seat, her insults becoming less frequent. James kept his head down, focused on his work. He was exhausted, and the last thing he needed was this. But as the plane continued on its journey, something inside him began to stir. He wasn't just going to let this slide. Not this time. He wasn't sure how or when, but he knew that when the time was right, he would make sure Karen understood who he really was.